Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on a Friday morning. I just downed some coffee, so I'm really ready for like a very, very lively conversation. So I'm going to just quickly introduce myself and then my speakers, and then we'll just get into it. So I'm Isha Nelson. I'm one of the London-based reporters for the New York Times. I cover the UK economy and finance. I also cover bits of Europe as well. First, we have Mark Campanale, who is the founder of Carbon Tracker Initiative, Mafalda Duarte from the Climate Investments Fund, and Nikki this is we were saying this, I know I was going to get it wrong, Mardas from Global Canopy. I would just like you all to actually take a minute and explain the work you do, because actually you're all coming at this from like slightly different perspectives. So I think that would be really helpful just to set the scene. Mark, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so about me, I was one of the founders of the ecology funds business at Jupiter Asset Management 30 years ago. So I did 20 years in green finance in the city, and then 10 years ago I set up Carbon Tracker, which is a non-profit financial think tank, and we model all future coal, oil and gas production and test it against climate limits. So our audience is financial institutions, pension funds that are shareholders in the fossil fuel economy, and we study the transition. And as part of that, I'm on the advisory board of something called GFANS, which is the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which is this new...
big initiative, yeah.
Yeah, 130 trillion initiative.
Be talking about that today, yeah.
Well, I lead the climate investment funds. These are funds that invest in developing countries, exclusively in developing countries, in a range of sectors: energy, agriculture, water, transport. So we have and we were set up in 2008. So we've actually been piloting a lot of first-of-its-kind investments in developing countries for a number of years. We have now a large portfolio of more than 400 investments in 72 developing countries. And we do this through 6 multilateral development banks.
So I'm Nikki Mardas. I'm the executive director of Global Canopy. So we're another non-profit, and like Mark, we also look at data. We're data-driven, looking at market impacts and dependencies on nature. My background is actually in big data, so I worked in technology and the mobile industry for many years, but then made the big shift across with a quite incredible moment, actually, of convening in the Amazon rainforest with 200 leaders of all stripes, and at a moment of sort of political transition. So our background as an organization is really focused on tropical forests, and if this is about greenbacking, you know, tropical forests are the original greenback, so I feel very much at home here today.
Great. So our session title is called Greenbacking the Future, Private Sector Finance and Climate. And I did want to just like really clarify here that we're talking broadly about private finances and not government money, rather than within that, you know, private assets as opposed to equities, etc. But I want to start off talking about what is working. You know, these are hard times, hard economic times, challenging political times for lots of people in the world, and I think it'd be nice just to talk a little bit about where the success has been, because I think over this past year we've really seen the finance industry, even more than before, get on board. There's been a lot of initiatives, as you said, there's GFANS, there's been a lot of, you know, we went to COP in Glasgow, and I was just amazed by how much of the financial sector was there, and we're like really trying to engage in this conversation. And then there are a lot of initiatives like the Climate Investment Funds that's been doing this for a really long time and has shown that there are ways to reduce the risk, to make projects work, and to work across private sector and the public sector to really see kind of amazing innovation happen. So, Mafalda, can you just start by telling us, you know, about the successes in using private sector finance to, you know, to fund both innovation, but also kind of big infrastructure projects and to bring down emissions?
I mean, to give you a sense, a perspective, back in 2008 when we were established, globally there was around 8% of renewable energy in the energy matrices, and around 90% of this was hydropower. So, you know, we talking about progress and having seen things worked. So what we did was, in a lot of the countries that we have invested, for example, in renewable energy, there hadn't been one single renewable energy investment. There wasn't a track record. Private capital was not coming into these markets, into these type of investments, particularly so because it was 2008 and the financial crisis at the time. So what we did in various countries, not just middle-income countries, but low-income countries as well, is bring in that risk capital, the concessional capital, so to basically take on risks that private capital is not well placed to take, or to bring down the cost of capital of these investments, and give comfort in many cases for the domestic debt markets to come in as well. One example that we have in our portfolio is Mexico. Back in the days, we financed the first two private sector investments in wind, and that catalyzed. Without that, the domestic debt markets weren't getting involved because of the macroeconomic context. So we came in with IFC and with the Inter-American Development Bank, and with that we managed to catalyze. The market really jump-started. I mean, for example, other examples on concentrated solar power or even solar PV. We have financed a lot of these investments in countries where this hadn't happened. In the concentrated solar power sector, for example, we managed to bring the costs down. Those are expensive technologies, and they were expensive technologies. We managed to, with the scale of the investments from all of the partners involved, bring the costs down, bring the learning curves up, start to generate some track record around those investments. But I have seen very interesting things, for example, in terms of mobilizing the local commercial institutions, local commercial banks, or even the microfinancial institutions. When we bring in capital and we can bring down subsidized interest rates for the first credit lines and help these commercial banks structure credit lines that they didn't have before for mitigation or for adaptation purposes, and across markets as well, both low-income countries and middle-income countries. We then see 2-3 rounds of these credit lines and no more public capital, concessional risk capital being necessary. And then you see the results on in the end, which is basically people with energy access, people with increased yields, with increased incomes. So a lot of what we have been doing over the initial 10, 12 years of our existence has been really to put the capital, the public capital, at play, basically, and demonstrate that these investments are sound investments in these markets.
And you've proven the case for it. So now it's a question of continuing to scale that.
Now it's scaled.
How we get even more people and more countries involved. Mark, you're in the room with investors a lot of the time. What has changed for you? Where do you think the success has been?
So the biggest change over the last 30 years I've been involved in green finance is that renewables has broken through as the cheapest form of energy in most, if not all, parts of the world. Now, the problem we've got is we've built an industrial system in the world that's based on fossil fuels. And the consequences of that, we have a financial system which is based on financing fossil fuels and the continuation of that economy. So we have to cut emissions by 50% in the next decade, and that means we need to transform finance to the same extent over a decade. So the good news on renewables, and I was just collecting some of the data, is renewables is growing at about 20% per annum globally. We've built 2,000 gigawatt hours of solar and wind, and that's set to reach about 40% by 2030. Because of that scale of growth. Now, here's a fun fact for those who like fun facts. If this growth continues for the next 6 years, wind and solar capacity is going to reach 8,000 gigawatt hours, which in 20 years is more than all the fossil fuel capacity that we've built over the last century.
It's a good fun fact.
So now that pace of growth is what will transform the energy system. And I think the real question we have to ask ourselves is the capital there, are we going to step up to the plate to support the infrastructure that we need to build, and the decommissioning of carbon-intensive plant and its replacement with low-carbon alternatives. And as we think about global population growth, particularly we're talking about the global south, can we leapfrog from a fossil fuel system where you've got no energy at all straight into a clean energy system? And that really means we need to be deploying capital at scale in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, where people are not on the grid or don't have access to energy or want to industrialize. And quite now, I'm not sure actually whether we have the financial systems in place that will allow the capital to flow, because we haven't built effective partnerships between groups like the Climate Investment Fund and private capital. We need to dramatically change that. And I just don't think that what we achieved at Glasgow has really broken through with the kinds of partnerships we need to build for this new age.
Yeah, this was still supposed to be the optimistic section of our chat. So I'm a little concerned that we've already veered into the poverty phase, but it's the scale of the problem.
The optimism is renewables are cheaper.
Yeah.
We are transforming the energy system. We don't need new technologies. We've got all the technologies we need, and we're improving on the technologies like hydrogen and battery storage. But still, we have to deploy $1 trillion a year to do this. And even with renewables being cheap and scaling and doubling in size, like we described, I mean, of course, let's be optimistic, but we also have to be realistic.
Nikki, it's only fair to give you a chance to also state your case for what's working.
Well, it's important to have a chance because we've been talking about fossil fuels and the energy transition for a long time in the climate debate, and rightly so. But if you want a positive note, it's that at COP26, nature showed up in the climate talks, in the climate debate. And they didn't just show up, they showed up center stage with the first big announcement of the COP being 90% of the world's forests at the top, at the leadership level, at the head of state level, committing to end deforestation by 2030, which is 11% of the global climate emissions, and they've not been in the debate. So, really, this is a really important and big deal. It's also deforestation and forests are where climate and nature meet, which has all kinds of implications for the planet. The good news in terms of finance is that the finance sector, following that lead, is also showing up on nature. So I've been talking to financial institutions about deforestation issues, risk, getting them to get companies to disclose about the deforestation risk for over 13 years now. But in the last 13 months, we've seen far more progress. As you said, the finance sector is finally showing up on these issues. Other good news, we've had the establishment and the incredible fast evolution of what is called the TNFD, a task force for nature-related financial disclosures, which looks to bring some of these issues that have been looked at from a climate angle and bring them in for nature.
Nick, I think we should take a step back and say it's kind of similar to the TCFD, which is the climate financial disclosures. So the idea of having they're not the same thing, that the finance industry does need two separate sets of disclosures to really tell us what's going on.
That's right. I mean, you've got the Paris Agreement and the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, sort of regulatory framework and information framework, if you like. And now, very fast evolving, you've got the same coming out for nature. And there are all kinds of reasons why the carbon lens can't capture, 11% of global GHG emissions come from nature, from deforestation. But nature's a huge part of the solution, and there are all kinds of other issues which are missed when you take a narrow carbon lens. So that's good news. You've got 2 days ago, you had a net zero big meeting of the climate champions coming together here at London Climate Week. You had Nestle and Unilever making joint statements on deforestation, but they've added in deforestation to what it means to achieve net zero under the net zero targets, the climate champions net zero targets. And that means that GFANs, that huge group of financial institutions with 130 trillion or so in assets under management, are now going to need to look at nature risk as part of their journey to net zero. Yeah. So that's progress too.
I think one of the things we know from this progress and from all the additional data and information we get, though, is it also shows us where we're lacking. And I think one of the things you pointed out is actually there's still a lot of money flowing towards deforestation and destructive projects. So how do you balance all of we're done with the positive part of this section. How do you take all that information you're getting and say, okay, well, now we know the scale of the problem. What are the ways to tackle this, particularly for deforestation?
Yeah, I mean, for deforestation, look, you need lots of investment. We need what Mafalda is doing for fossil fuels and for energy and for that transition to come into the land transition. That's the big next thing is we need a reform of agriculture. That's going to take huge amounts of money. If you look at a country like Brazil, we've got very high deforestation rates. You've got a lot of degraded land, and that degraded land could be used productively if investment was made rather than opening up new land and adding to the climate problem. So finance is needed for that. It's a huge opportunity for the finance sector. But what you referred to is the absolute wall of money, which is pointing in the other direction. So at COP, we had 20 billion committed, a mixture of public and private, for forests to help end deforestation. Great, 20 billion, public, private. But on the other side of the equation, that 20 billion is up against a trillion in agricultural subsidies, or more than a trillion, that don't have a nature and climate lens on them in the first place. And then 7 trillion in investment and lending going into the supply chains for beef, palm oil, soy, commodities that are driving 2/3 of deforestation. You've got 20 billion on one side, you've got 7 trillion, 8 trillion on the other side, and we, the taxpayer, are funding it as well as private finance.
Go ahead, Mark.
I'll take your 20 billion and I'll
please
match.
Oh, cool.
So if we look at this, the problem with the capital markets and in particular with fossil fuels, Carbon Tracker, we published this new report last week, which was the update of our unburnable carbon report, and we calculated there's 1,000 gigatons of CO2 listed on the world stock exchanges. To keep to below 1.5 degrees, that means 90% of that will have to stay in the ground.
Okay.
Now, the future revenues of that this is the reserves owned by Shell, Exxon, Glencore, BP. The revenues that represents at today's prices is $113 trillion. So if you have to lose 90% of that, that's a net present value of around $45 trillion. Now, you're going to have to lose 90% of that. But, I mean, the first thing you'd have to do is stop coal and oil companies listing on the stock exchange, raising even more money. I don't know if you saw there was a coal IPO in the London market during the COP. Did you see that? And there's been 2,500 coal, oil and gas IPOs on the New York Stock Exchange, the London Stock Exchange, in the last 10 years alone. So to stop the problem, one of the things we have to do is sort of say, well, if we can't burn what we've already financed, why are the financial markets allowing these companies to come to the market and raise even more? And we've not resolved that sort of paradox. And I've raised it with GFANZ. I've asked GFANZ to look into this. We've got to get the financial markets in the right shape. And it's not just with the energy companies, it's also with the logging companies. We have to realize there's dozens and dozens of logging companies listed on stock markets that log tropical forests, a number of which end up in people's pension plans. And on the other side of the work, this is with our sister group, Planet Tracker, we found there's 300 seafood and fishery companies listed on exchanges that turn over about 500 billion of revenue from seafood. So if we want to green financial markets, we actually have to put in place rules and regulations to ensure that we support the SDGs, we support sustainable forestry and sustainable agriculture and renewable energy, but we also have to make sure that we're not funding the stuff that tears down forests.
The problem is there's not a huge amount of appetite for those kinds of restrictions at this point.
Well, I think we have to create the political conditions and the political will, and I think what this conversation does is allow people to explore, if we're going to green the debt markets and the equity markets, we have to put in place the right rules. We have to ask the policymakers, we have to ask politicians, we have to get GFANZ looking at this, and Mark Carney and Mayor Bloomberg thinking about the architecture of the financial system, not just in a more direct sense, like what you can take to market. I mean, I don't know if you remember this. So do you remember the Russian timber group that almost listed on the stock exchange? An area of forest is in Siberia the size of Belgium. You would have thought that stock markets wouldn't be raising capital for those kinds of things anymore. And the answer is they still are.
But one of the things we're all told frequently is, that the cost of the transition, while it will be a cost, is a lot cheaper than the cost of inaction. And yet, that message, I think, is a pretty clear and simple one to grasp. But then we have all these examples of it not really working. Mifad, I wanted to ask you about how we do this moment. Climate investment funds started in 2008 during a recession. At the moment, we have very high inflation, very high cost of living, interest rates rising quickly, and a sense that there is this kind of supply-side shock that's causing inflation. We will have consumption falling around the world because of the cost of living increasing, and central bankers and economists are really, really nervous about the outlook. The economic outlook isn't good, but their focus is we must fight inflation. And so we saw, the first half of the year, the S&P 500, the SP 500 had its worst first half for 50 years. Now, in this kind of big, major risk-off environment, how do you convince investors to stay committed to these climate projects and to see them as being low risk? Or how do you design the projects so that they are low risk in an environment when people are really, really concerned about the economic growth outlook?
I mean, I hear, and you're right, I mean, this is a really concerning macroeconomic, geopolitical environment. And I think it's important to make a distinction between developed countries and developing countries. Because developing countries are really disproportionately disproportionately impacted. As a matter of fact, the UN released a report not that long ago that calling it the finance divide. What we have is that we have the double of the number of countries in developing countries in high risk of debt distress. They are paying on average 14% of their revenue in debt service vis-a-vis developed countries that pay around 3.5%. On the overall outstanding debt of developed countries, it's 1% interest rate. The developing countries is 3%. So we have, and of course, in this macroeconomic context, with these countries showing up under this fiscal pressure and constraints, what you are seeing is, and even this was in 2020, this was even prior to the war in Ukraine, Bloomberg had said, you are seeing outflows, you are seeing a lot more investment in developed countries than in developing countries on clean energy, when you actually have to see the opposite, because 2/3 of the investments actually have to happen in developing countries. All of the infrastructure gap, the global infrastructure gap, sustainable infrastructure gap, which is massive, it's several trillions a year. 2/3 of this needs to happen in developing countries. So we actually have a context right now where, of compounded crisis, pandemic, Ukraine, climate, all disproportionately impacting these countries. So what do you do? We have to use public capital, and this is something I know Mark and I agree on. We actually have to use public capital much more judiciously, in partnership with private capital, take on the risks that the private capital can't take, and really deploy at a different scale.
And how much
developed countries need to
cross-border as well?
Yeah, I mean, developed countries need to understand if they manage to pump all of the fiscal stimulus that they did, in the context of the pandemic, and also now in terms of the war in Ukraine, what we really need is to think along the same lines, if we are going to tackle the climate crisis in terms of trying to help developing countries. Mark was talking about coal. There's a big difference in terms of transitioning away from coal in developed countries and developing countries, because the coal fleet in developing countries is a lot younger. The coal fleet in developed countries is a lot older. So economically, it makes the whole sense to immediately transition away from coal. But what are we seeing right now? We are actually seeing an increase in coal use because of the war in Ukraine. And we are seeing you yourself as, you have estimates saying 500 gigawatt of new coal in planning, pipeline, all of the different stages.
But the paradox of this, of course, is that these plants cost more to run than renewables. I mean, today we've got gas in the UK, and even in the global south, it's true. In the UK, it's 4 times more expensive to run gas in the UK than it is for renewables. And on electric vehicles, 6 times cheaper to run an electric vehicle than it is to run a petrol car, because you know about the high cost of putting petrol in the car. So it does seem strange you've got people building out coal in the global south, even though it's more expensive. And some of Carbon Tracker's analysis, it's actually cheaper to close down an inefficient coal plant and build a new renewable energy plant from scratch. So there's a lot of plant that can be retired profitably if we get the right policy environment in place in countries where governments set the arrangements for a lot of this power coming onto the grid and set the terms for it. And we don't actually have competition and markets in some of these economies which are dependent on coal.
But there's, sorry, Asha, we could take over the two.
Yeah, be careful.
No, but I mean, there is also, when you look at, if we were to have a more detailed discussion on coal, if you look at Germany and what they put in place for coal transition, including a really big package of financial support for the communities.
Sure.
Because there's one thing, is the infrastructure, is the assets, and then you have the social component, which is as critical, if even not more important. But there is this difference. I think we have to recognize in developed countries that, the support that we are talking about right now, the bringing in of the public capital with the private capital, in driving investments and really serious capital flows, private capital flows in developing countries, it's just not happening.
Yeah. The scale is just really not there yet. I want to move to audience questions in 2 minutes, so please start thinking of them, and then I'd like to take as many questions as possible, so keep the questions short. But while you're thinking of your questions, I just want to ask you each to give me 30 seconds on the debate between whether or not there should be divestment or we need to keep up with this transition process for oil and gas.
So I'm not going to talk on oil and gas, just as I'm not going to talk on coal, because you won't want to hear from me on that. But on questions of deforestation, questions of nature, that wall of money, that 7 trillion that I talked about, that is driving, that all of us drive deforestation through in the products we use, that needs to be leveraged for active engagement. I mean, we need active engagement from the investors, from the investment community, with better information in order to get change from companies on the ground. Because if you just pull out of some of the worst companies, other capital is going to flow in. We won't see the transition in what I'm talking about, in the deforestation space in agriculture. We won't see the transition that we need. So divestment, yes, absolutely in the worst cases, absolutely when you don't see movement against targets, but we really do need active engagement. We need to take that 7 trillion plus and leverage it to get change. Otherwise, we won't see what we need to see. And I might just say, I mean, I know we're going to go to questions, but one big missing element here is for all that we've been talking about is better information. And just as to throw it out there, if there's one other positive bit of news linked to the developments that we've been seeing, is that ESG metrics are imploding, right? They're being seen for what they are, which is not very much use. And now ESG funds are losing money. We need reform of the ESG system and have better metrics in order for any of this to work.
Even the ESG is just picking up on Nikki's point. I mean, even ESG, the metrics and the standards we have right now move away capital from developing countries. There's recent studies from the World Bank showing that because it's so based, the metrics are so based on development, already existing development, exactly, that it actually moves capital away from developing countries. But on the question of divestment, I think, my take on this is that we really need to have the regulations in place that make that inevitable.
Mm-hmm.
We're in the middle of a huge energy transition, and we're moving from a system that's got 2 parts to it. One is the coal-fired power stations and the gas, which represents your capital equipment, your stock, and then you've got your flows, your gas and oil coming in. In this new energy system, we're losing half of that. We don't need to transport coal, oil, and gas around the world because the energy is going to be around you in the form of sun and wind and so on. And the energy system will get smaller as it gets cheaper. On the divestment question, we think about this a lot because it's a bit, if you're going through a technological revolution, the shareholders in the English canal companies just as the railroads arrived. They didn't sit around going, let's engage with the canal companies in the rise of the threat of railroads. And the shareholders in Blockbuster, the video company, didn't sit around and go, let's engage with Blockbuster as Netflix rose. It was a technological transition. And the same is happening with fossil fuels. It's the reason to divest from fossil fuel production is because it's a dying it's a dying sector. We're moving from an era of molecules to electrons, and that moves out the fossil fuel system. Now, that's the reason why you would divest. It's purely a financial one. It's a risk one. Now, when it comes to the use of it, cement, steel, aviation, shipping, now I think the opposite's the case. I think it would be irresponsible to divest. I think you need to sit down and put in place the financing to decarbonize, and their engagement and commitment by shareholders is a really clear merit to stay invested. So it's a nuanced answer. But the divestment movement's reached $40 trillion. That's not all church committees selling it on ethical grounds. You know, a lot of that is people rationally choosing, saying it's an end of one system, like the canals, there's a new system, and it's called renewable energy and electric vehicles, and it's a purely financial risk control decision to get out of fossil fuels.
Let's take some questions. All right, so I think we have microphones, so I'd like everyone to wait for the microphone to get them. I'm going to take, okay, let's start with you. We'll take one here, and then we'll take next to you. Whoever wants to.
Thanks very much. Great conversation from the panel. I've been in the...
introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, Mark Gainsborough. I've been in the energy industry 40 years. I have, over the last 5+ years, been investing a lot in renewables, offshore wind, solar, everything, nature-based solutions, the whole lot. So I know a lot about all the decarbonisation levers. And one of the things that seems to me that is kind of missed a bit is that energy transition is the biggest investment opportunity for financial markets over the next 30 years, by far. It will be the new tech once people get their head around it. But at the moment, the dialogue is often about all the problems and risks and how difficult it is. So my question to the panel is, what can financial markets do to shift it to people seeing the opportunity and then attracting the investment to pursue that opportunity?
I have 3 questions in this corner as well that I want to take really quickly.
Yep, thanks very much. Charles Perry, partner at Rise, sustainability consulting firm. So in the discussion with Mafalda and Mark about an example on just transition, because I think that's Mafalda's point, let's take South Africa. Isn't that a great example? Because with the JET-P partnership, Just Energy Transition Partnership, the 8.4 billion coming on the back of COP26 in public money is heading that way. Eskom is bankrupt, so the state's energy system has collapsed. Now, is that a good example? Can it be replicated elsewhere? And how do you get the private money to come in on the back of that public commitment?
Do you want to pass the mic to the lady next to you? Thank you.
Thanks so much. Amanda Ellis from Hawaii with the Julianne Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory. 3 quick questions. Hi, Mark. Great to see you. Wonderful panel. Thank you. So first question, why is it that renewables are still only around 10% of the total energy mix right now? Second, IMF data 2020, 5.9 trillion in fossil fuel subsidies. The green transition looks pretty cheap to take this point. Why are we not moving faster on getting rid of fossil fuel subsidies? And third point is the regulatory one that was raised. Any comments on the Supreme Court decision yesterday?
And there's one person behind you. Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. My name's Mira Sham from Imperial College London. I work on food systems transformation in Africa. So my question is, are there any success stories for transferring funds to food systems actors in Africa and where policy innovation has driven that? I would like specifically any comments on actors beyond farmers, if you've got any. So you're looking at seed producers, fertilizer companies, transport, distribution, etc. Thank you.
I'm going to plug our panel tomorrow on resource scarcity and security tomorrow morning as well. Any on this side before? Yes, we've got one lady at the 2 ladies at the back here. Thank you.
Hello.
Yes.
Thank you. This is Florencia Coller from Atmos Lab. We are a sustainability consultant. And I wanted to ask Mark, you were mentioning that it's cheaper to make a plant of renewable energy today. And I wanted to ask in which terms it's cheaper, because last time that we did an analysis for PV panels in France, actually manufacturing them versus the energy that we have to consume for a building. It only paid off 70 years afterwards to manufacture a solar panel instead of just using what is there in France, which is nuclear-based, obviously. So in which terms it's cheaper?
And there was Lady Dicia.
Good morning, thank you. Amy Bowe, I'm a sustainability and climate risk specialist working with the oil and gas industry. I guess picking up on the question around divestment, I think the difference between blockbuster and energy majors is that the global economy is still dependent on oil and gas in particular, whereas the global economy is not dependent on VHS tapes. And I think we're seeing now, the types of volatility that can occur in the market when we have supply shocks or a supply and demand imbalance. So how do we transition, or how would you suggest that we transition capital without sort of stimulating this type of volatility, which can, in fact, disrupt the energy transition? And we're seeing that risk now.
I'm going to give you the joy of picking what you want to answer, because I want you to keep it really, really short, because I also want to say, how do I find out if we have online questions? I probably should have asked that before I sat down up here, but if anyone could flag to me from the team if we have any online questions too. Mark.
The answer to the fossil fuel crisis is not more fossil fuels. That's clear. It's the fossil fuels that's given us volatility. The answer to that is to get off fossil fuels rapidly. And if the oil and gas industry was serious, the IEA did this analysis, published it last year. What is the average capex spend of the oil and gas majors on renewables? The answer is somewhere between 4 and 5% of its capex. The other 95% is going into fossil fuels. 95% of the world's clean energy has been built by people are not involved in the fossil fuel industry. So so I have some frustration with your comments. I would love to see the oil and gas companies putting 85-90% of their capex into renewables. That would tell me that they're interested in the transition, to be frank.
Actually, I'm going to make you answer the renewable ones. Yeah.
On the levelized cost of energy, we can get into the numbers. We can look and compare a megawatt hour for gas and so on. We can do the details offline, and I can send you the tables. I completely agree with you that the renewable energy is the biggest opportunity for investors in the world right now. Totally agree. And I think the points about it being more efficient, more reliable, and cheaper, we have to get that across. Far better than we ever have. But at the same time, this slight difference is that working inside a large fund manager, I've done it on many times, is where do you put your renewables and where do you put your fossil fuels? If you're producing your fossil fuels at $10 a barrel and selling it for 120, the spread on that is huge. Whereas if you're producing your renewables and it's getting cheaper, the margins are falling. So it's better for an infrastructure part of your portfolio than perhaps a listed type of part of it. And I think what's happened with pension funds is we're not allocating enough capital from infrastructure pools to support the renewable energy transition, because sometimes people have to think through where does it fit, and you may be raising capital from pension funds. Not all pension funds can do private markets, for example, and that's one of the constraints on it.
And certainly their exposure to developing countries is very small.
Yeah, that's also a problem.
But I would agree that the volatility that we are witnessing. So I subscribe to most of what Mark said. If we move more towards clean energy matrices, because these are localized resources, we will have, countries will be less exposed to this volatility, and it would be good to see the fossil fuel companies invest more, in particular now that they're making great windfalls of profits with the current prices. On the question of the South Africa Just Energy Transition Partnership, we are actually quite involved in that process and are supporting it. Not just in terms, we launched in Glasgow a new Accelerating Coal Transition Investment Program, but we are supporting the broad Just Energy Transition Partnership. Hopefully it will be a model that will be replicated to other countries, and in fact there are discussions ongoing with other countries, but it entails three things. It entails policy and regulatory reforms, all of the governance issues. It entails the infrastructure and asset piece, but it entails the social transition, the just transition. And we have to get these three things right. And as you said, we'll have to find a way of using that public capital the 8.5 billion to really mobilize much more of the private capital.
I'm going to interrupt you because I want to give Nikki a chance to.
Yes.
Great, thanks. Well, I mean, most of those questions, again, were on energy, which tells us something. I mean, going back to my opening remarks, it does tell us something important. But there was a question about agricultural transition. I mean, I'm not an expert in agriculture in Africa, but across the tropics, you've got a lot of smaller projects. You have issues of aggregation and scale, but we're beginning to see now some aggregation. We're beginning to see billion-dollar funds coming from some of the bigger banks. Rabobank, for instance, the Dutch Agricultural Bank, has put together a fund that invests in landscapes. So we're beginning to see movement on what is a tricky set of problems about scale in the agriculture transition in the tropics that needs to be cracked. One, if I may, quick other comment, just thinking around all of these investments through the lens of dependency on nature, I think is incredibly, incredibly important. Yes. Because if we let the natural infrastructure go, it pulls the rug out from under all of these investments. So, we did some work that looked with UN partners, an open source tool called Encore that looked at financial sector dependencies on nature. So the World Economic Forum used that to say 50% of the global economy depends on nature. Well, that's an underestimate. Everything depends on nature. The Dutch Central Bank, the Brazilian Central Bank, Dutch Central Bank said a third of Dutch assets, investments are highly exposed to nature risk. So I would make a call for a much, much greater investment and focus on a detailed understanding of dependencies on nature as a driver to the question about how do we drive money into the energy transition, how do we drive money into the agriculture transition, and protecting nature. We'll do that when we realize the enormous costs associated in detail with not making those investments.
We are almost out of time. I'm going to take 2 more questions, but only because I want to give you plenty to talk about amongst yourselves in the break. So the lady in the jacket just here, and then I feel like you had your hand up quite high before as well, so we'll go for you afterwards. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Benedita. I'm with Res Publica and Student Academic Magazine. And my question for the panel is, what are your perspectives on growing alternative monetary forms like Bitcoin helping or not helping the green transition?
And one last thought.
Hi, I'm Edgar's. I'm part of a company called Shoal. We're building a sustainable savings account. We're building a sustainable savings account.
Not quite working, so give us 1 sec, let's fix that.
Okay. All right, third time lucky. All right. I'm Edgar's. I'm part of a company called Shoal. We're building a sustainable savings account. And one of the things that I noticed in this conversation, it's we're in this kind of wholesale finance land. And one of the things that we're trying to crack is how do we get, people on the street, people like us, to think about climate finance? How do we get, everyday savings transferred over to support the cause of energy transition or to invest in nature, whatever. So, for example, in the UK, where there's 300 billion pounds sitting in cash ISAs, and these people who put their money in cash ISAs, right, their banks don't tell them what they're doing with it. So the question is, do you think it's important for the public to be more aware? Will that make a difference, or should this debate stay in wholesale finance land? What is the opportunity?
Yeah, thank you. So we're basically out of time. I think that's an interesting point as well, but it brings us back to the conversation we were having about ESG and the kind of metrics which are used both in the kind of institutional investor space, but also by ordinary people in retail funds, etc., who wanted to understand and are kind of discovering that maybe these ESG scores and metrics aren't all they were cracked up to be, and the help you thought you were maybe doing with your money wasn't quite doing it. So we are clearly out of time, but I'm going to give you everyone a last word. Don't get me in trouble with the organisers of the event. Nick, I'll start with you.
Well, yeah, I think it does make a big difference. And I've sat next to banks because I sometimes go into schools and say, well, go to the counter and ask if there's deforestation in the products you just bought. That's an annoying question to get from a 9-year-old, and if you get 100 9-year-olds asking you that question, that might have an impact. And then I say, well, call your bank and change your pension, and Make My Money Matter say pension change is the best thing you can possibly do, as all of us, to drive change. And I was in one event sitting next to a banker who said, yeah, that's really annoying. Yeah, that works. We get lots of calls. So I would say absolutely changing finance, ESG metrics, we need to reform them, fix them, deepen them. So please, let's take the Bitcoin expertise and genius and put it into radical transparency products to get better ESG.
Yeah, I mean, just to say that I've concentrated my comments a lot on energy, but we do invest a lot as well on nature. In fact, we also launched recently a nature program, and we have been, which links to that question, because a lot of what we have done in the forestry sector is actually provide finance to the communities, to the indigenous people and local communities, and engage with these communities and make them aware of the linkages to climate change, and the fact that what they might be doing actually is not just impacting negatively their livelihoods, but also is linked, they are making a contribution to further greenhouse gas emissions. So absolutely, I think, and also the example that I was giving through the microfinancial institutions or even smaller financial institutions that have the close contact with the communities, this is all part of the process. Because in order for you to have the communities invest in some of these technologies or solutions, they need to be aware of what is actually happening and why should they care, and what's the linkage to their livelihoods and situation. So I think it's really important, but we need to do a lot more. I mean, you're right. A lot more people need to think, and I have said this in the past as well, we have to understand that we are all leaders, because we are consumers, we are investors, many, not all, certainly in developing countries. We are parents, many of us as well. So in all of these facets of life, we have a role to play when it comes to climate, and we have to take ownership for that, not just say it's the governments or the private sector that need to do things. No, we have to do things as well.
Mark? Final.
Yeah, no, in all the years I've been involved in green finance, I still come back to we need to reform the architecture of how financial markets work, the bond markets, the equity markets. If we don't have rules, we shouldn't be surprised if companies involved in deforestation or overfishing or coal make it onto the stock market and then make it onto people's pensions. I mean, we can have all the ESG metrics we like, but the starting point should be we should be reforming markets to stop many of these companies ever getting onto the stock exchange in the first place. And that requires reform, and it requires governments to intervene and to act. I'm all fans for voluntary action and for individuals to act, but we need to reform the way markets are structured and the way they're set up and how they're run.
Thank you. Thank you all for being an engaged audience as well, and a round of applause for my panelists.